Ark of Noah. All right, now a couple things right off the top. This is a reconstruction. This is a scale model of the Noah's Ark. No, it did not look like the children's thing with portals that got their giraffes' necks outside. Okay? How would you like to ride on a boat that had a bottom keel shaped like this? You want to ride on that boat? I don't think so. This is all it was. It didn't have a bow. It didn't have a stern. All it had to do was float. All it was a barge. In fact, that's what the Hebrew word tibah means, is barge. All it had to do was float. God was the captain of this ship. All it had to do was survive. So if anybody hasn't seen that, we can take it and just pass it around back there. And it's real light. It doesn't weigh much. If you haven't seen it, take a look at it. All right, then a couple other things I want to show you, which we'll get to. Oh, be careful with the steps. This is the book. Someone asked what book that I recommend. I used to have a library of 6,000 volumes, and in it I probably had at least 150 or 200 books on creation versus evolution and so on. This one I highly recommend. Dr. Walter Brown is the author. Dr. Walter Brown is a physicist, and he worked for 12, almost 13 years at the Goddard Space Center. He was a retired Air Force fighter pilot colonel and taught 12 years at the Air Force Academy. This is an amazing book about how God did everything in the beginning and the flood, the creation and the flood, and it answers a lot of questions. In fact, from this spot in the book, right about there, all the rest of the book is all about answering questions. 200, I think there's 125 or questions that get most often asked, and he answers those. And so I highly recommend this book. This book has had ACLU file a lawsuit against it. There's probably about 400 books on how the Grand Canyon was formed in Arizona. If you go in their bookshop, this was the only book that showed an alternate theory to their slow build-up of layers. The only book that was for sale, and ACLU filed a lawsuit to have it taken out of the bookstore at the bookshop at the Grand Canyon. So they hate this. They hate this because Dr. Brown has got it figured out. All right, so I recommend that. Okay, and then this we'll get to in a moment. This is not an actual fossil. Actual fossils are illegal. You're not allowed to own them. Some guy found one on his farm, his ranch in Arizona, and tried to sell it on eBay and got arrested by the FBI. Since 1975, Richard Nixon signed a law that these are international heritage. You're not allowed to sell them, and so you're supposed to turn them in so that they can go to the proper museum for analysis and so on. But anyway, what this is a raptor claw. Raptors they probably stood about this tall, and they were one of the most vicious of all the dinosaurs. And this claw is the one that stuck up in the air. They had claws that they walked on, and then they had a claw that stuck up in the air. If you've ever watched Jurassic Park, there's one of them where the raptor's standing on the back of a guy, and to break his neck, the raptor just takes this claw and goes in the back of his neck to break his neck. And so this is the one that sticks up in the air, but they're very vicious with these. So if anybody wants to see this, I also brought this. It's an exact duplicate of an actual fossil. All right, let's get into Noah's Ark. We're going to deal, hopefully, I'd like to be able to get done today, but that remains to be seen. We did part one of the Ark. This is our series where we're focusing on studying to show ourselves approved unto God, a workman that needed not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. We're going to try part two. I'd like to be able to get through the Ark today. The last 3 lessons in this series is next week we'll deal with true biblical tongues, and then we're going to deal with what the Bible has to say about hell, and then we're going to deal with who is Satan. So let's discuss the Ark and the Genesis flood. First, just a little bit of review. Just a few slides of review so we can see where we are. What are the 5 most asked questions about the flood? These are the first 4. How did Noah get millions of animal species in the ark? We showed last week it wasn't millions, it was thousands. First of all, 60% of all creatures in the world are aquatic. They're amphibian or aquatic, and so they don't even need to be in the ark. Up to 40%, there were ancestral species, which means we showed you last week a taxonomy chart where 110 dog species we have today have been created from 4. 4 dog species are responsible for 110 different types of dogs we have today, and they did it in less than 300 years. Man has tinkered with a lot of this to create all the species that we have in the world today, and so Noah didn't have to deal with that many. All he had was like those original 4. Okay, then how did enough water get? How did the water get high enough to cover Mount Everest? We'll deal with that. How did just 40 days of rain give enough water to cover the earth? And if a flood covered the whole earth, where did all that water go? Last question is, if the Bible's flood actually happened, why can't we see signs of it today? Well, actually, they're everywhere, but we'll get into that as we go. First, the 4 parts of the study. By way of review, again, there's 4 parts to our study. The earth before the flood, what it was like, then the ark itself, and then the Genesis flood, how it happened, where it happened, so on. Then number 4, the earth after the flood. What was the world like when Noah stepped out of the boat? Okay? And we already dealt with the earth before the flood last week. This week we're still going to deal with the ark of Noah, as well as numbers 3 and 4, if I can get there. So number 2, let's finish up where we were last week with the ark. The word is, the Hebrew word in the Bible is tibah. Tibah just means barge. Just like a river barge, it has no propulsion. It has to be pushed by a tug or it doesn't go anywhere. It just floats. That's exactly what the ark was. All it had to do was float. It wasn't built for luxury. This was not a carnival cruise. This was survival only. All God wanted them to do was to stay alive. And so that's the ark means tibah. We also said last week, the ark had no bow, stern, tiller, rudder, keel, or sails, portals, promenade deck, or propulsion. Yeah, all it had to do was float. And so God told him to. Now, almost every picture of the ark, including the one that I made, I painted brown. But the truth is, what did we say last week the color of the ark would have been closer to? Black. Because it was covered with tar inside and out. Pitch inside and out. So it would have been closer to the color of black. And then we showed you just this scheme. Now, if they use our cubit, and remember our cubit, set your elbow on a table, measure from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, 18 inches is the average for a human being, a human male today. So that 18 inches is called a cubit in the Bible. Anytime you see 10 cubits, that means 15 feet. Okay, because it's 1.5 feet for each cubit. But the thing is, we showed you last week that everything was much bigger before the flood. Trees were bigger, animals were bigger, insects were bigger, so were people. The average height of a person would have been 10 feet. Truth is, Goliath would have been a pipsqueak before the flood. That's why that recessive gene has come down through time, and the sons of Anak were huge. Goliath and his brothers were huge because it's a recessive gene that's in humans. And every once in a while, it pops up in families. Sometimes you'll see huge people all over the world. And so we talked about if we use our 18-inch cubit, the boat was 450 feet long or 300 cubits, 75 feet wide or 50 cubits, and 45 feet high, okay, 30 cubits. And then we talked about the draft of the boat this side would have been 15 feet. So the bottom deck would have been below the water, okay, right at or below the water. And then Noah would have put the larger animals in the bottom, medium-sized animals in the middle deck, and humans as their quarters, as well as avia, birds, lightweight animals would have been up in the top. And then Job chapter 6, verse 14, 16 talks about the construction project. We talked a little bit about Noah. Noah was a spiritual man. Keep in mind it says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, which means he was looking. You need to understand that. It wasn't that God just said, okay, I'm going to pick that guy. No, that guy was looking for God. And he found him. And no other thing we know about Noah is he had to be rich. Noah had to be extremely rich. How do we know that? This was no small project. He took more than 1.2 million board feet, more than 5,000 English gallons of tar. Would have cost in 2020 dollars. And we know what Biden's done to our economy since then, okay? So that's 2020 dollars, $3.5 million to build. It would have cost more than 13 million man-hours to build, and he would have also had to be able to purchase or make no less than 3,000 large and small clay pots and baskets in order to store the food. He didn't have Frigidaire freezers on board the ark, okay? So he would have stored it in baskets, and it takes time to weave them, or you gotta buy them. And same with clay pots. It takes time to shape them, to burn them in a kiln, to bring them out, or go buy them, one or the other. So Noah was a wealthy guy. Now we continue from there. Let's talk about the dinosaurs, the true story. First of all, people think there are millions of species of dinosaurs. There aren't. We've only found about 380 species today. That's it. That's total. That's big ones to tiny ones. That's it. That's all only species, about 380. We believe that's only about 15%. Well, why do we say that? Well, that's because bones have been found of critters that the bone doesn't fit anything we know right now. So it's obvious there's other critters we have not put together yet in this world. But just the ones that we know, they come in a variety of different shapes, sizes, and personalities. Some of them were very huge, like Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus. Some of these dinosaurs were huge, but harmless. They actually feared men. By the way, do you know, except for maybe alligators, crocodiles, caimans, and Komodo dragons, almost all reptiles will run away from you when they see you? They're afraid of man, and they were no different then. Their size did not stop the intimidation. They were still afraid because they had been hunted. They found in Australia, they found a dinosaur with a human spear point inside his chest cavity from a hunting exercise. So yes, they are afraid. So some were huge, some were tiny. The Compsognathus was very small. It's not even bigger than a chicken. In fact, this is a scene from Jurassic World, the Lost World Jurassic Park, where this little girl has a sandwich and all these little Compsognathus want that sandwich. And she doesn't realize how big a danger she's in because they attack big groups. So she was in a lot of danger at that point. And some were harmless, okay, like the Barneysaurus and the Dinosaurus, very harmless. Okay. All right. No, seriously, some were harmless. This is called the Onototitan. Onototitan was a duck-billed dinosaur. All it ate was plants, and it weighed a lot. It was pretty big, but it was harmless. It wouldn't harm anything. And then some of them were really scary. Sarcosuchus literally ate T-Rexes for breakfast. They would, just like today when a crocodile in the Nile will lay with his head below the water level and wait for a wildebeest to stick his nose in the water and then come out of that water like lightning. That's how they would do. But they would eat any dinosaur that dared to stick his face down in the water. And so they were scary. They have found some of these crocodiles that are over 50 feet long. These were monsters. Okay, they're as big as almost as long as this room. Very, very huge, very scary stuff. Now, were dinosaurs on the ark? They existed before the flood. They were destroyed in the flood. I'll show you how we know that. But were dinosaurs on the ark? The answer is yes. Some. Some were on the ark. How can we know that they were passengers? Well, here's one way we can know. Because of what Job eyewitnessed. Now, Job would have been, first of all, it's the oldest book in the Bible. It's older than Genesis. It's the first book that was ever written. And Job would have been, his actual life, he would have been 100 years old when Noah died. Noah lived 350 years after the flood because his lifespan decreased, which means because he was exposed to radiation, solar radiation they were not exposed to before the flood. Had that radiation been held off the way it was before the flood, Noah would have been the oldest man, not Methuselah. The way it was, he came within 19 years of Methuselah, and that's with the solar radiation that came after the flood. So Noah would have lived the oldest man of all. But 250 150 years after the flood, Job was born. So Job was 100 years old when Noah died. Did he know him? Probably. Everybody knew Noah. I mean, a guy like that's a celebrity. I mean, he survived the flood. He survived on the ark. Sure, they probably made pilgrimages to go see him. So, but Job wrote of two of them. Turn to Job chapter 40. Find the book of Job. Before I got saved, I used to call it Job. The book of Job. It doesn't matter what you call it. Just turn there. Back before I got saved, I thought the book of Concordance was the last book of the Bible. Okay, chapter 40. Let's begin reading. What's he describing? I believe, when I read this, he's describing a brachiosaurus. Okay, now how did Noah get that thing on his ark? He didn't. It was a baby. It was a baby. If any dinosaurs got to get on the boat, they were children. They were infants because they took up very little space. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Chapter 40, beginning verse 15. He calls it behemoth, okay, which is a Hebrew word for giant creature. Okay, so here he goes. Behold now behemoth, which I made with thee. He said, he eateth grass as an ox. It was a herbivore. Lo, now his strength is in his loins. In other words, a very strong belly area. His force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. In other words, his tail's as big as a tree. The sinews of his stones, and again, this is talking about his testicular anatomy, are wrapped together, and so scientists know. His bones are as strong as pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. They actually have made tools from the bones of these creatures. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him, no sword can approach unto him. Men are afraid to go after this creature. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and fens. In other words, he likes being along the river's bank, where there's lots of things he can eat that are soft, plenty of trees, stuff grows well by the rivers. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him round about. Behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He's not scared of anything. He's not in a hurry to go anywhere. He trusted that he can draw Jordan into his mouth. In other words, when he starts drinking, he drinks and drinks and drinks. He taketh it with his eyes. His nose pierceth through the snares. Nobody's able to catch him. That's how monstrous this thing is. So Job's seen this. Eyewitness account. And then he is probably seeing something like Pleurodon. Now, there's a lot of scary creatures that were in the ocean. Like Pleurodon's one of them. Job describes him. Let's look at chapter 40. All right, I got the wrong verses there, okay? Chapter 41, next chapter, okay? And he talks about Leviathan, verse 1. Canst thou draw Leviathan out with a hook? In other words, no fisherman can catch him. Or his tongue with the cord which thou lettest down? Can thou put a hook into his nose? Or bore his jar through with a horn, with a thorn? In other words, you can't harpoon him. Will he make supplication unto thee? In other words, he's so fearsome, he doesn't ask man or seek man's help for nothing. Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him as a servant forever? No, nobody messes with him. Wilt thou play with him as with a bird? Or wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? You're not going to catch him or domesticate him. Shall the companions make a banquet of him? Nobody catches and eats him, okay? Shall they part him among their merchants? Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? You're not going to harpoon him. Lay thine hand upon him, remember the battle, and do no more. In other words, if you ever have a confrontation with this creature, you'll never want to meet him again. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down, even at the sight of him? In other words, it makes you sad and depressed, even if you see one at sea. None is so fierce as dared to stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me? Who hath prevented me that I should repay him whatsoever is under the whole heaven of mine? I will not conceal his parts, nor his power his comely proportion. Who can discover the face of his garment? In other words, nobody's successful in catching this guy. Who can come to him with double bridle? You're not going to domesticate him like a horse. Who can open the doors of his face, and the teeth are terrible, roundabout. In other words, he's got teeth all around his jaw. His scales are his pride, shut up together as a close seal. One is so near to one another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another, they stick together, they cannot be sundered. His kneeslings is a light that doth shine. His eyes are like eyelids of the morning. In other words, when a lamp shines in his eyes, they turn red at night. Probably the last thing a fisherman wants to see is big eyes like this looking back at him in the dark from lamplight. Just like when your headlights hit the lights of a deer or some other animal. Out of his mouth go burning lamps. Again, that has to do with the fact that, and sparks of fire leap out. That's just, again, this is language that's used to describe this fearsome creature. Not that he's a fire-breathing dragon. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, and out of the seething pot of cauldron his breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. His neck remaineth, his strength and sorrow turned into joy before him, and so on. Next verse says he has scales, and so it's probably a Liplorodon, could be something else. Someone proposed that it was some other type of creature. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's monstrous. Okay? And they have found the skull of a Liplorodon, and the one that they found is 13 feet across from here to here. From the side of its jawbone to the side of its jawbone, 13 feet across. Each of these tables is 6 feet long. Add another foot to this, and that's how wide his jaws are. You want to mess with him? I don't think anybody wants to mess with him, amen? All right, now here's the dino passenger criteria. Did they get on the ark? Yes, some of them would have been allowed. So what is the dino criteria? First of all, God did the choosing. God did the choosing of all the animals. Noah didn't go out after them. They came to him by God's command. So God did the choosing. Probably no carnivores. I assume God did not allow carnivores on the ark. Okay, at least not dinosaur carnivores. What? And by the way, not all scientists are agreeing that the T-Rex is even a carnivore, or that it is rather a vicious thing like Steven Spielberg showed. Truth is, most scientists believe it probably ate carrion, dead things, possums laying on the road, okay? All right. By the way, Karen and I had to laugh the other day. There were a couple crows that were sitting up in the tree, and a walnut was in the middle of the road, and the crows were sitting there watching the walnut. They didn't want it, but they knew that's bait for a squirrel. And a squirrel's going to run out in front of a car and get killed, and then we're going to have lunch. We had to laugh. That would make a good cartoon. But anyway, none of them that had behavioral issues, okay? Like the raptors. Okay, only youths. If God took any, they would have been the babies. And it is at this time, during the time of the ark, that God began hibernation and estivation. Well, what are hibernation and estivation? It's sleep. Estivation is summer sleep, hibernation is winter sleep, but God would have made a lot of these creatures just go to sleep. Well, what was the point? Why do that? Well, less food's needed to be taken on board if they're going to sleep about 300 of the days, and you're going to have a lot less poo to remove. Okay? A lot less. All right. Now, what about dinosaurs that were not boarded upon the ark? What you're looking at there is what's called a graveyard, dinosaur graveyard. And in that pile that you're looking at, they have found these graveyards in 40 different places on the earth, and they have found mingled in the dinosaur bones, the bones of sometimes 30, 40, 50 different dinosaurs that all died in the same place, and many of them were mortal enemies, and yet they died right there in that place, as if they were all trying to escape something. Something had scared them all, and they all ran to this spot to be delivered, okay? But they didn't make it. They all died, and so they have found these fossil graveyards all over. All Terrians that were not on the ark died in the flood. Terrian is an air breather, land walker, and then their bodies were buried under mud. Those of shallow burials became fossils. Shallow burial means the bones are under pressure, but not a lot of pressure enough to decay them, and so they just rotted away and be turned into a fossil. But those that were buried deep, large groups of them were buried deep, they became goo, oil, which we pump out of the ground and use to fuel our car. And over 4 dozen fossil graveyards have been found all over the world. And this is one of them. This is the one in Nebraska. This one's located in Chadron, Nebraska. If you ever want to see one, drive up to Chadron, Nebraska, and go look for the fossil graveyard. They'll let you in. It's a site. You can actually go in and see it for yourself. Now, you know that 90%, 97% of all dinosaur fossils are found buried in sedimentary rock. What about the other 3%? Some of them were buried under sand, but most of that other 3% are frozen. They have found them in Antarctica. They have found them in the Arctic, Siberia of Russia. Frozen. They have whole dinosaurs that were frozen. Flash frozen. Some of them with food still in their mouth. Some of them with undigested grass in their belly. Before the stomach acid could even dissolve it, they were flash frozen. And we can get into the science of how that happened, but that's not of our purview. So, they're found in sedimentary rock. Now, you already know what the root word of sedimentary is. It's sediment. Where do we find sediment? Always underwater. That is the only way a dinosaur fossil is preserved, is because it's encased in mud, buried beneath water. Okay? So, their answer then. If all these fossils, all over the world, this is what they say. I'm serious. This is a stupid answer that secular scientists give. All the fossils in the world were because of local floods. In other words, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River overran. They were buried under the mud, sediment of the river, and that's how they died in local floods. Okay. Do you know how many spots there are on this world they found dinosaur bones? I'm showing you 200 dots on that screen of millions of places they have found dinosaur bones. And they're going to tell you that every one of these places was because of a local flood. Okay, now this is where my kindergarten mind kicks in, okay? What if we suggest rather that the dinosaur fossils were encased at the same time in the same single worldwide event? If you say that, you will lose your job as a professor at a state university. You'll be censured. And they'll call you a crazy religious fanatic. You're a weirdo. How dare you suggest that all those fossils were created at the same time? But they were. And it's staring them right in the face. And the Bible says they are without excuse, because it's right there looking at them. Now, where did the ark land? Let's get next to where did the ark land. First of all, it landed upon the mountain, singular. The Hebrew word is singular. It doesn't end in I-am. It is a singular word. It landed upon the mountain of Ararat. So as the water came down, the boat would have just set wherever God wanted it. It would come straight down and just set. Okay? And now this is, in 1908, George Hagopian and his son went to the summit of Ararat and saw this. And he drew this picture. He saw it. It was sitting there. It wasn't in ice. It wasn't covered in snow. It was there. He testified that it has a set of steps that were attached to the front. He put his son up on top. There was a big hole. He lowered his son down through it. His son said there were cages and everything. And they brought back a piece of wood that was tested at 5 European universities. They said the wood is covered in some kind of tar or bitumen. And the wood in all 5 universities dated to over about 5,000 years old. And so this is the site of George Hagopian. Where is Ararat located? Right there. It sits in eastern Turkey, right almost on the border of Armenia. Okay? Azerbaijan and Iran. All of them have a piece of Ararat. Okay? This is what the mountain looks like. This is a monastery that sits at the base on the Turkish side. This is a monastery that's sitting there, and a piece of the wood from the ark is in that monastery. And they worship it, you know, like most icons. Catholic and Russian Orthodox churches, they have icons and they worship these things. And listen, I believe that the burial shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, but I don't worship it. If it burned up tomorrow, I'd say, well, that's a terrible loss. But my faith doesn't rest on a piece of cloth or a piece of wood or a piece of anything. Okay, I walk by faith, not by sight. So this is Ararat from the Turkish side. If we go around to the back side of Ararat, this is what it looks like by satellite. You will see a huge gorge on the other side, on the northeast side, called the Hora Gorge. that monastery we were looking at is right there. So you can tell the direction we were looking when we took the first picture, okay? Now, in World War I, two Russian pilots, they didn't even know each other. One was Aramis Rudinov, and the other was Jasper Maskelyne. They both flew airplanes, biplanes. Maskelyne's was in 1921 after the war. They testified that as they flew over Ararat on one of their missions, they saw a large section of the Ark sticking out of the ice. Just because the ice had melted back. Some years it melts back, some years it's bigger. And it melted back. And so they found this, and then an Army NCO during World War II, Ed Davis, was looking for places to drill for oil, and on his vacation he went to the top, and he's the first man to testify that the Ark has been broken in half. There's two pieces now sticking out of the ice, and they're slid apart. They're apart from each other. Okay, so you can read Ed Davis's testimony as well. And so they were broken in half and slid apart. That is also confirmed today with satellite pictures. The two pieces are located right about where I put those white squares. Okay, now this is a larger picture of it, and this is taken from a DGS satellite in 2003. The two pieces are there, and they've slid apart. The distance they have slid apart now is 1,500 feet, or roughly a third of a mile. And this part, and the lower part, if you blow it up, you can actually see the three decks. They've collapsed down on each other. When it tore apart, the decks have come down like this, right on top of each other. And you can see one here, one there, and then the bottom one. So the three decks have collapsed. And so we know where it is, and we know it's there. Now remember those questions? Here's those 5 questions again. How did Noah get millions of animal species on the ark? We answered that. He didn't. He took ancestral species, maybe 35,000 total species. Many of them slept. None of them were adults. It wouldn't have been giant elephants. It would have been baby elephants. And so, now, how did that water get high enough to cover rivers? How did just 40 days of rain cause the flood? And where did all that water go? And why can't we see signs? Let's deal with those now. Number 3. What catastrophic ELE in scientific jargon means extinction level event. ELE, that's what they call it. If a huge asteroid hits the Earth, they call it, that'll be an ELE, an LE. It'll be an extinction level event. Well, what could have caused what extinction level event? Well, this is the shape of Pangaea, the one continent. There's only one continent. And this is the shape of the continent. And the Bible says the world that then was being overflowed with water in the book of 2 Peter chapter 3. So here's Pangaea. Where was Noah been living at the time? According to what we can make out from the Bible, he'd been living right about there, in the land we would refer to today as northern Mesopotamia. That's about where he was living. Everything was beautiful. Everything was tropical. The average temperature of the earth was in the 80s. Palm trees were everywhere. Palm trees were in northern Russia. I mean, with this whole world, because of the greenhouse and because of the size of the sun and everything, it was tropics everywhere. And so that's about where Noah would have lived on Pangaea. The scientists have found a strike point that would have killed the earth. They know where it is. Okay? Sometimes even secular science and our secular equipment is able to find stuff. Okay? The strike point that would have separated Pangaea is known as the Chicxulub crater. The Chicxulub crater. The distance between where the strike point was and where Noah would have been living, about 3,000 miles. Roughly 3,000. In other words, if you lived in New York, it would have struck in Los Angeles. And so would you have felt it? Probably a shock of it, yes. But as far as actually hurting you, no, you wouldn't have been hurt from it. The Bible says God broke up the fountains of the great deep. And so he struck the earth with some kind of space missile. Some scientists don't believe it was it. They believe Pangaea just swelled like a balloon and split apart. Doesn't matter. You're still going to get the same outcome. And so this is the Chicxulub crater. Most people don't realize the Gulf of Mexico is the crater. The entire Gulf of Mexico was formed by one strike point. It would have struck coming almost from this direction. Okay? The meteor, asteroid, or comet would have hit right here from this direction. Bam. Coming from the south-southeast. And so that when it hit, it created what we now call the Gulf of Mexico. How do they know this? Well, first of all, this is how it would have radiated out after the strike. And today, using NASA satellites, which are able to see through jungle, they can make the trees disappear. They're able to see this crater strike point. It's on the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is what it looks like when you take the trees away. They're able to know that it's there, and this was the strike point. And so there would have been, this is Earth's crust. Remember we said last week, the Earth's crust is thin, slice an apple in half. The ratio of the skin to the apple is about the same as the Earth's crust to the core. It's a very, very thin crust. And so the fountains of the Great Deep were underneath that crust, and the continent of Pangaea was pushing down on it, high pressure, compressing all that water. And then Earth's mantle was down here below. When the meteor, or whatever it was, struck, it broke open Pangaea. When it did, the waters that were being pressed down on by Pangaea would have come out of that crack at supersonic speeds. And so, which is exactly what happened. We know that the crack that ripped open would have raced around the world at about 23,000 miles per hour. That crack. And so the water pressure coming up out of there would have been astronomical. It would have literally shot water into the stratosphere from the pressure of pushing down of all the way to the land doing it. And so waters under great pressure would have shot 25 miles into the stratosphere. It would have looked similar to this, except it wouldn't have been clean, pretty blue water. It would have been dirty, filthy, rotten mud water. Okay? And then, if you want to know what I'm talking about pressure, here's a little science experiment you can do at home, and you'll understand what I mean. Fill your sink at home with water. Cut a piece of cardboard that fits just about the square of the sink or whatever shape your sink is. Then put a hole, take a hole punch or something, and punch a little hole, maybe about 3/8 of an inch across, in the middle of the cardboard. Then drop the cardboard onto the water top. Then put your face right over the hole, okay? And take your fingers like this on the cardboard and press down on the cardboard real hard. You're going to get a face full of water. Water is going to come out of that little hole like a rocket, okay? And that's exactly what happened when the waters came out. Now, this mighty fountain would fall back to earth as rain. And that's the first rain the earth had ever seen. The Bible says no man had ever seen rain until this. And so it wasn't a pretty rain like this. It would have been more like this. It would have been a muddy, choking rain that literally would have drowned just in mud anybody that was encased in it. And 95% or more of the flood water came from the compressed ocean that lay below the continent of Pangaea. And so it would have caused a split. And outside, the ones that were mocking, calling Noah cuckoo for building an ark in the middle of the desert. What a fool. He pays good, but he's crazy. And now their tone has changed. Now it has changed from scoffing to screaming. Now they're screaming, and it would have been hard to listen to on the inside of the ark. And it's going to be exactly the same of those that mock Jesus Christ and say he's not coming. But when he comes to get his people, it's going to be terror on earth, hell on earth for everyone that's left. So I would say if a person's not saved, you have a very small amount of time left to get saved. There's just a little bit of time left. And so they would have seen the boat floating away and known that's our only hope, and there's no hope. And so what happened was North and South America would have slid away from Europe and Africa. And the biggest mountain range in the world is unseen. You can't see it. It's that middle thing right there. And so the waters that were compressed between the two would have, that you see that layer right underneath between the two, that would have come rocketing out. That which was in the west would have slid to the west. That which is in the east, as the bottom rose up, it would have just slid away. Just like a sled going downhill, those big land masses would have slid away from the mountains that were rising up. It just pushed them away. And Europe and the African continents would have slid to the east, and North and South America would have slid to the west at a much faster speed than Europe and Africa. And what lubricated them was water. If you think water is not a lubricant, I defy you to go down one of those without water. it'll take the hide right off your body. Start sliding down, and then have them turn the water off halfway to see what happens. They'll haul you off in an ambulance, okay? It'll burn you up. Water is lubricated. And so, the largest mountain range in the world, you can't even see it. It's right there. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Mountain Range. It has mountains that make Mount Everest look like a baby. Neptune Massive. Thor's Twins. These mountains are gigantic, but you can't see them. They're underwater. They're 2-3 miles high, but you can't see them because they're tens of thousands of feet down into the water. And so here's a schematic where it looks like there's Earth's mantle. In Africa and Europe would have slid to the east, and North and South America. North and South America would have slid faster than Europe and Africa. Up to 40 miles an hour, according to Dr. Brown's calculations, the North and South America would have been sliding at approximately 40 miles an hour. Now, that don't sound like much, but when you get that much land mass moving at that speed, that's massive. That is a huge speed. And the waters would have been rocketing up, and the wider the crack got from wearing away and spreading, the waters wouldn't have been going 25 miles in the sky. They would have come down, 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 and soon they would have just been boiling out, literally all over the world. And that was the very first rain, very first time. And that's the 40 days of rain that Noah saw. It wasn't the rain that caused the flood. The rain was an after effect of the flood. And it started. And as those two land masses slid apart and the water emptied underneath, as the two land masses began to touch, it would have ground to a massive halt. Okay? And the mountains like these, the Himalayas, the Rockies, the Alps, the Andes, the Urals, the Kajolans, and many, they didn't even exist before the flood. So this idea that the water covered Mount Everest, no, it did, but it didn't, because there was no Mount Everest. None of these mountains existed. They didn't exist before the flood. Well, let's suppose you ran your car into a brick wall. Guess what's going to happen to your hood? That's exactly how the mountains were formed. Right there. When India, the peninsula we call India today, broke off of Africa, and we know that it did, when it slid into the belly of Asia, guess what it caused? As it rammed into the belly, up went the Himalayas. But that phenomenon happened all over the world. For instance, when Italy, which belonged to Africa, broke off of Africa, it slid into the belly of Europe, it created the Alps. Okay? Same thing is true when what we call Norway and Sweden, as that began to swing away from Europe, it ran into the Arctic plate, and when it did, up came the Kajolin Mountains. And as the European one pushed this way and the Asian one pushed this way, they pushed like this against each other, and they created what is known as the Urals. The two continents hit like that, and they just ground against each other, and up came the Ural Mountains. And as North and South America slid to the west, same thing happened. They ran into the Pacific plates, and up went the Rockies that slid all the way down to the Andes. And you know how we know this is true? Running all the way around from Patagonia all the way up to Alaska is a trench. You know what will happen if you take a piece of paper? Take a piece of paper and push it like that. You know what you're going to find? Part of it's going to go up, and part of it's going to go down. That's exactly what happened there. And that's why there's a huge trench out in the ocean beyond North and South America. Because as the Rockies and the Andes went up, that gigantic trench went down, just like pushing a piece of paper together when the two collided. And the scars of this great flood are literally everywhere. Let me just get through these giant landlocked salt lakes. In fact, when Grand Lake, that was in the middle of America, broke, it broke at Chaco Canyon. When it did, it literally washed this out. Colorado River did not form that. Okay, you can go to the end of the Colorado River, you'll never find all the stuff in the middle of the Grand Canyon. That was all washed out by cavitation. The stuff that had heavier pressure on it stayed, and the softer stuff right after the flood just washed out when Grand Lake broke at Chaco Canyon. It just washed the Grand Canyon out. Dinosaurs are buried in mud. All the fossils are buried in mud. Polystrate fossils, trees that literally cross all layers. They've found trees even with the roots going up and the branches going down, carried there by floodwaters. Coal seams like this one in Butte, Montana. 60 feet of coal. It takes 10 feet of vegetation to make 1 foot of coal. How did that much vegetation get to northern Montana? It was born by water, and then it turned into coal. All the sands, the Sahara Desert, Gobi Desert, all the deserts, and then the Namibia Desert, all of them are sea sand. They were deposited there by the flood. Though this is why when you go up to Vancouver in Canada, you can see the Rocky Mountains, and notice how soft the layers were when they came up out of the ocean. They squished together, and all those layers were so soft from being mud that they just created a weaving pattern. The signs of the flood are literally everywhere. They find handfuls of seashells on Mount Everest, on Mount McKinley, on top of Pikes Peak. Because all of these things were once below the ocean, before they rose up into the sky. What about the beautiful white chalk cliffs of Dover? What they are masses of coccoliths. Coccoliths are like a barnacle, like a sea creature. Millions of them died, and then they formed this chalk that when the waters receded, left us the beautiful white cliffs of Dover. Not only that, the dinosaur, the critters, the animalia that was trapped under high pressure formed pockets that were sealed off, and they decayed, and they literally became what we're putting in our cars and airplanes today. Only the blind or the willingly ignorant. You know what Jerry Clower called people that are willingly ignorant dumb on purpose. Okay? Only the blind or willingly ignorant would be oblivious to seeing such evidence. And then we'll get into chronology. I'm out of time again, so it's going to have to be 3 parts, okay? All right, let's dismiss.